I'm here with Tom Ricks, the author of The Gamble, the American Military Adventure in Iraq, 2006 to 2008. Welcome, Tom. Before we get to the policy, I just want to ask you about the book, because there's a great story inside here of insurgents inside the Pentagon taking over. You've got a diminutive British woman who's a pacifist. Tell us a little bit about the story inside this book.
Sure, it's quite a striking story, and I didn't know it going in, even though I've been covering the war for the Washington Post. How much it was that in 2007 the war was turned over to the dissidents, to people who had fundamentally disagreed with the invasion or who thought the war had been executed wrongly. Ambassador Crocker, the top American diplomat in Iraq, for example, reveals in the book that he had opposed the invasion. A lot of the people they brought in, whereas you say, unusual advisors to have. Three of the most significant advisors were foreigners: an Australian infantryman turned anthropologist, a Palestinian American who was also a pacifist, and Emma Skye, this diminutive British woman who was anti-American and anti-military, but thought the right thing to do was to help the Americans at this point in the war. It was a very different war. There was a lot less hubris in the American effort and a willingness to talk to even enemies, and as General Petraeus eventually did, a willingness to put the Sunni insurgency on the payroll.
So your first book, Fiasco, was the first stage of the war. Now we have The Gamble, sort of the second stage. Where are we now in Iraq? There's this feeling, there's been the recent election. Oh, things are getting better in Iraq. What's your view?
My view is that there are two fundamental misunderstandings that Americans have about this war. First was how tough the surge was. It was not just a matter of putting a few more troops out into Iraq. It was a very tough 6 months, probably the hardest phase of the war so far. The second theme of the book is this war is far from over. Yeah, the war has changed several times. It was an invasion, it morphed into an occupation, into an insurgency, then into a civil war, then into an American counteroffensive. It's changing again. Just because it's changing doesn't mean it's ended. The elections the other day? Yeah. Remember the elections a couple of years ago? Purple fingers, people coming out? Followed by a civil war. So I think there's a lot of reasons that Iraq '09 is going to be very tough, and in fact harder than the last year of Bush's war. And I think there's a good chance that Obama's war in Iraq will last longer than Bush's war.
So who gets this? Does the president get this? He talked about 16 months removing troops. What do the commanders tell him? Where is there a clash coming here in terms of the ground truth versus what the president may think?
I think there will indeed might be a clash by the end of this year. Obama's campaign promise to get American combat troops out of Iraq in 16 months was a fatuous promise. When Americans heard it, what they heard was, I will have no more American troops dying in 16 months. But it was a false phraseology, combat troops. Well, newsflash for Obama, there is no such thing as non-combat troops. There is no pacifistic branch of the U.S. Army. Anytime you have American troops out there, there are going to be some of them fighting and dying in counter-terror missions against al-Qaeda. If you have American advisors with Iraqi troops, they're going to be getting into fights, and some Americans will be dying. So I think we're there for a long time, and as long as we're there, unlike, say, the occupations of Korea, Japan, or Germany, American troops will be engaged in combat. General Odierno says in the book he'd like to see 35,000 troops there as late as 2015, well into Obama, what will be Obama's second term. So I think by the end of this year, you're going to see a conflict. Obama's going to want to see troop numbers coming down. Odierno, the other big O, as they call him in Iraq, is going to say, wait a minute, you're holding general elections here in December in Iraq. That's exactly the wrong time to take troops out.
So let's look then at another Obama promise, which is related, of course, to Iraq, because Obama has talked about switching troops from Iraq to Afghanistan. But that switch hasn't happened. Where do things stand in terms of Afghanistan, and how does the ground truth in Iraq affect what's going to happen and can happen in Afghanistan?
They do relate to each other very much. The odd thing about Barack Obama's promise to get troops out of Iraq so he can use them in Afghanistan, it's not a departure from Bush, it actually is a continuation of Bush. It's the same unwarranted optimism that plagued the Bush administration about Iraq. Remember, the original Bush plan for Iraq was to be down to 30,000 troops by the fall of 2003. Here we are more than 5.5 years later with 5 times that many troops. So I think Obama's going to have more trouble getting troops out of Iraq than he suspects. You're also seeing a bit of friction right now in discussing where they go in Afghanistan, Pakistan. Now that's partly the shakedown cruise of a new administration. It's also because you got some pretty big egos out there. Richard Holbrooke, the new American envoy, and Dave Petraeus, who's now the U.S. commander for the whole Middle East, that's kind of like putting Godzilla and Mothra out there. They're both going to think they're in charge, and they're both going to be using their ray gun looks at each other. But I do think the Obama administration has gotten something fundamentally correct, which is it's not the Afghan war, it's the Afghan-Pakistan war. And the Pakistan part of it is the more important part of it. As a friend of mine, Andrew Exum, puts it, it's hard to fight a war in Afghanistan when the enemy decides to fight it in Pakistan.
Tom Ricks, thanks very much.
Thank
Author
you.
of The Gamble. Thanks for being with us.
You're welcome.